I've seen a fair amount of critique levelled at Blasphemous 2 from it's too easy to there's no challenge now they've removed the instant death spikes to there aren't as many enemies and too many of those are recolours. I'm going to put aside the discussion on difficulty because difficulty is an incredibly subjective concept, and what some people feel is difficult or challenging is not the same as others. Some people have faster reactions, some people have slower reactions, and especially if you've played the original game recently, you're still going to have some of that muscle memory which will translate over into the second game. But what I do want to say something about is the critique about enemies and recolours, because I do have something to say about that. It's wrong. Well, it's partially wrong. Does the game have more recoloured or palette swapped enemies than Blasphemous 1? Yes. Yes, it does. But even if you discount every single one of those recolours, Blasphemous 2 actually has more enemies than the first game. In fact, if you include the 5 enemies in Blasphemous that had their own recolours and add those recolours to the number of enemies in Blasphemous 1, it still only breaks even with Blasphemous 2 without including the recolours, and you have to have included the 3 new enemy types that were put in the Wounds of Eventide DLC for that number to hold true. If you completely discount recolours in general, there are 40 enemies in the base Blasphemous. This doesn't include bosses, just base enemies, and 43 if you include the Wounds of Eventide. But there are 48 enemies, again, completely discounting bosses and discounting recolours, 48 enemies in Blasphemous 2. If you include recolours, we've got 48 enemies in Blasphemous and 65 in Blasphemous 2. So are there more recolours in the sequel? Yes, by quite some number. But there are also more enemies in general. It's clear, therefore, that these recoloured enemies, even though they bring with them different elements to work with, they've actually worked against the perception of enemy variety, which I suspect is probably not what they were intending. There's also the critique that Blasphemous 2's enemies aren't as visually interesting as the enemies in the original game. Again, I don't actually think that is particularly true. I think, again, that there is a little bit of nostalgia, but also a little bit of exception bias, where certain enemies in the original game were really iconic and really stood out. And for me, at least, we had the crucified women who got those big kind of marble statues on their back that slammed you with them. There were the bisected martyrs, the ones with that were kind of cut in half and that had saw blade boomerangs, and they were iconic and memorable because they kept knocking me off into spikes. But they got a fairly iconic look as well. And then there were the enemies that weren't used all that often, but they had kind of forelegs and coffins on their back and big kind of teeth-laden heads, and they spat fireballs at you. Those enemies were really memorable. And I think actually that thinking about those enemies might elevate all of the other enemies in the game. Because actually, there's quite a lot of crossover between enemies in Blasphemous 1 and Blasphemous 2. And before you say, oh, they've just reused everything, it's like, actually, no, they haven't. A lot of the enemies in Blasphemous 2 that are the same as in the first game actually aren't the same sprites, because the art style has changed. The acolyte enemies, the skeletons with the candlesticks, you might think that the ones in Blasphemous 2 are identical to the ones in Blasphemous 1, and they're not. They're completely redrawn. Do they have the same attacks and stuff? Yeah, as far as I can remember, but they're not actually the same sprites So a lot of work went into not just updating the game and bringing polish and quality of movement and stuff to the systems, but also at bringing the sprite work up to the same standard as well. So in order to really make sure that my information for these perceptions that I've got are correct, I went and put together a spreadsheet. Yes, a spreadsheet. How exciting. You now get to look at a spreadsheet. You tired of the word spreadsheet yet? So, if we take a look up and down this list, you can see that certain rows are highlighted in orange. And you'll be able to work out why they're highlighted in orange if you just look across. We've got enemies that are the same, identical, or near as damn it identical, on the same rows. So the enraged pilgrims with the wheel, they are there. And I think they actually are the same sprites. The crawlers, the wax crawlers, the mud and sewer crawlers, same enemy, essentially different sprite work. Here we've got the acolytes, and you can see the base ones versus the base ones. They're very much different. The flagellants, again, do they look the same? Yes. Are they the same? No. New sprites. Spear of the Church, I think they actually are identical. The Restless Bones versus the Mermaids, they're essentially the same enemy. They're actually not the same sprites. The Bell women that swig potions and they set themselves on fire. The Sepulcra Errante, I can't speak Spanish, obviously. They are the same. I don't think they are actually the same sprite. I think they've been redrawn, or they've certainly been recoloured. Wakeful Alcoves even. These Leaper boys are the same as the Percherons, and so on and so forth. The Escalon, I haven't got a picture for the Blasphemous 2 ones. I've forgotten to put that in. But yeah, the paintings are essentially the same enemy, even though they've got different sprites, and so on and so forth. So that was one of the first things that I did, taking a look at, is there that crossover? There's also some minor crossovers here. So these guys, which are a big source of complaints about, oh yes, they're just recolours, these incense hammers or heavy melee, as they're actually called in the files. They are somewhat similar to the Guardian and Infant enemies from the first game, so they're kind of similar. And likewise, the Wraiths and the Shrouds in Street Awakes, they're a little bit similar, but not a huge amount, I must admit. If we look up and down, I'd argue that Blasphemous 2 also has some pretty iconic enemies. We've got these guys, the Forest Witches, that get murderized by their own owls if you break their concentration. You've got these guys who throw spinning tops at you in the House of Embroideries, which I really quite like. You've got these aggravating women of the sea who summon watery, I think they're sharks, but they could be dolphins or giant tuna fish, I have no idea, who constantly knock you back. We've got the Sickle Wraiths. Again, I don't know what any of these names actually are, who remind me very much of the Godskin duo from Elden Ring. And of course, we've got arguably one of my favourite enemies in the game, the Fire Monks, who spew fire at you and burst in a very satisfyingly animated way when you kill them. And there's also these guys, the Iron Maidens, who only show up like 2 or 3 times in the game. And they remind me of the Abductor Virgins a little bit from, again, Elden Ring. And of course, the concept of something being iconic is very subjective. What is iconic to one person might just not be somebody else's cup of tea. So, I'm not trying to tell you that you are wrong if you think Blasphemous's enemies are more interesting, or even if you think they are better. If you think the first game had better enemies and more interesting enemies, that is entirely up to you. That is subjective. I am, however, telling you that if you're saying Blasphemous 2 has fewer enemies than the original, you are objectively wrong. Not subjective. Subjective means that people can disagree with you based on the evidence that they've got. Objectively, you are wrong. The numbers do not lie. Blasphemous 2 has more enemies than the original. It has more enemies than the first game had, even including the DLC. But it does have more recolours, so that it can play with the spell damage system, the damage types, a little bit more. That unfortunately seems to have filtered through a bit of perception bias that actually the game has fewer enemy types. It does not. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Stay safe. Stay fabulous. Stay tuned for a little bit more Blasphemous 2 content. I've got another video or two in me on this. Yes. You've now looked at a spreadsheet for a chunk of time. Well done you. Cheerio. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, why not click the like button and consider subscribing. Remember, you can ring the bell notification icon to get notified when new videos go live. And until next time, cheerio.